Chairman. Thanks so much, ladies and gentlemen, fellow nationalists, fellow members. I thank you in particular for the 1-minute tribute to Valerie Tyndall. Valerie Tyndall was a very fine individual. She was a member of our party, a founder member of our party, along with her husband, John Tyndall, and along with her father, Charles Parker, who was the first national organiser of the BNP. Valerie Tyndall joined the National Front in the early 1970s, where she met and married John Tyndall. I can tell you that the National Front in the 1970s was a very, very similar party to the British National Party now. Very similar types of patriotic, serious-minded individuals joined and made the NF in the 1970s. I know that the NF in the 70s had one or two different techniques that we have now, but fundamentally the same sort of people, and Valerie Tyndall joined the NF at about, I think, 1973, almost 40 years ago. A very fine person, a very fine, very kind and generous person, very supportive to her husband John Tyndall, who was the NF chairman in the 1970s and founded the BNP and was for many years the chairman of our party. She died last Friday after a short illness. She was very brave right up to the end, and then when the pain took over, she was given, I suppose, morphine or whatever, and she just slipped away quietly. So I appreciate the minute silence that you accorded her. It always gives me pleasure speaking here in Basingstoke. There are people in this room, members, activists I've known for 20 years. There are members in this room who I've known for 30 years. There are members in this room I've known for 40 years. So there you are. We've known each other a very long time. And I think on this occasion, I think we're entitled to pause and congratulate ourselves, because the last 2 years we have shown our potential, we have shown what we can do, and we can show what's out there for us. I refer to the Euro elections of 2009, when almost 1 million people voted for our party, and we got our 2 Euro MEPs elected. Nick Griffin, party chairman, and Andrew Bronze were both elected to represent Britain and the BNP in the European Parliament in Brussels. That really put us onto the big time, that 1 million votes and those two members of ours being elected to a major institution. That was 2 years ago, and last year at the general election we put up a record number of candidates. We fielded over 300 parliamentary candidates. We fielded over 700 local government candidates. In total, well over 1,000 candidates standing from one end of the country to the other. A magnificent achievement. It shows what we can do, and it shows what results that we can obtain as of now from the British people. And I will say that the explanation for the level of support that we've seen these last 2 years, and the explanation for the fact that we can field 1,000 candidates and put out millions. I think in the general election we put out, I believe, 27 million leaflets alone in the general election. That's in addition to what went out in the local government elections. That, the explanation for this, that we can achieve all this, the explanation is, in my opinion, that we are being recognised by a large strata of the British people as the only party that faces up to the problems and the threats facing our country and facing our people. When I have spoken at your meetings before I go any further, I just brought this along. Here is the souvenir edition of our general election campaign. All these 12 candidates of ours, these lady candidates, they all saved their deposits from one end of the country to the other. I know some of these ladies personally. They're very fine individuals, very, very brave. This woman here is Sharon Wilkinson, who stood for us in Burnley. Sharon Wilkinson got herself elected as a Burnley County Councillor. She also got herself elected as a Lancashire County Councillor. A very fine woman. I've known her and her husband. Her husband is John Cave. They got married a few years ago. She keeps herself her original name that she has. I know her husband, John Cave, is now the Deputy Mayor of Padiham, which is a suburb of Burnley. And when he was voted in by his fellow councillors as deputy mayor, and next year automatically the mayor of Padiham. Oh, they all got excited in the chicken house. I mean Westminster Parliament. So there you are. Some wonderful people. Here's the ladies, and altogether that was a tremendous general election campaign to put up 300 candidates. It shows that we have the ability to organise on this scale, and I say the explanation that our ability to organise on this scale is that the British people are turning to us, significant strata of the British people are turning to us in such numbers that we can mount these campaigns. And British people are turning to us because they see that we are the only party that faces up to the dire threats to the future of this country and to the future of our people. And as I said, I've spoken at your meetings before about the crime, the level of crime that is now destroying civilised life in the inner boroughs of our cities. I've spent most of my life living in London. In inner London, as in inner Birmingham, as in inner Manchester, the levels of crime are horrific and are destroying, literally, civilised life. Everything I say here is not an exaggeration. On the contrary, everything I say is factual, and I prove every fact I say. Here is the headline of the London Evening Standard. Our London local paper comes out every evening, and here it is. Every day in London, every day, 5 teenagers are either shot or stabbed. Every day, 5 teenagers. Yesterday, 5 teenagers today, 5 teenagers tomorrow. Shot or stabbed. Not always fatally, of course, but no one wants to have a bloody knife stuck in them. No one wants to have a gun fired at them. And we're just talking here about teenagers. We're not talking about the 20-year-olds or the 30-year-olds. That level of mayhem. Now, many of us are in this room, I'll speak for myself. I can remember when we Britons, or us Londoners, if you want to, I'm a Londoner, us Londoners, we Britons, were proud of the fact that we were one of the most law-abiding societies in the whole world. I think there's only 2 countries in the world whose police were not automatically and regularly armed. That was the police in Britain and the police in New Zealand. Because we're such a law-abiding society, we were the only 2 countries whose policemen did not automatically, as a matter of course, have a pistol at their hip. And I remember when I was a school kid, for the first time taken on some sort of school trip, going to France, from Dover to Calais on the little ferry. We got to Calais. One of the first things you noticed was that the French police all had pistols. You think, blimey, pull it out, could shoot you dead if you wanted to. Well, it is staggering. We were so innocent, so law-abiding, and took it all for granted. When I was a child, if your mother was out shopping, you knew that behind you'd have to put your finger in the letterbox. There under the string was the key. So you come home early from school, you could fish the key out on a bit of string behind the letterbox, let yourself into your house. You wouldn't dare do that now. You could travel on a bus late at night and just wait for the bus to come round the corner, and we'd go home in the bus. I tell you, you wouldn't want to travel on a bus late at night in London now, particularly not upstairs, because that's where the trouble starts. It is no exaggeration to say that civilization is collapsing in these inner areas. Compounding all that, adding and amplifying all that, is the constant mass immigration of vast numbers of foreigners into our country against every vocal and justified protest. Over decades now, the British people, in opinion poll after opinion poll, have made it absolutely clear we want to stop the immigration. In spite of that, in spite of every natural caution, in spite of every warning, millions of foreigners have now been let into our country, and they are being allowed in. 500,000 foreigners come in every year into this country. It's now got to such a state, 500,000 foreigners are let in every year. That is 1 million more foreigners every 2 years, wanting our welfare, wanting our welfare, wanting our benefits, wanting our houses, as my friend talked about, wanting hospital beds, wanting school places, wanting our jobs. 500,000 foreigners every year, adding to all those already here. Immigration in London is so great that in large parts of London, the British are a minority. You can travel. I travel by public transport. It suits me not to own a car. There's one good thing about London. It's always going to be a good thing. The public transport system is very, very good. There's plenty of buses, plenty of trams. In Croydon, they've got trams. Plenty of little sort of local suburban trains. The underground service is good. The negative side is, of course, you take your chances, particularly night. All these stabbings, 5 stabbings every day, mostly take place in the evening. There's a murder every day in London. Every day there's a murder. I could bring you down. I have dozens of headlines like this. The horror of it fascinates me, to be frank and candid. The horror of it, of what's happening to our capital, which is duplicated in Birmingham and duplicated in Manchester, is horrific. There's been so much immigration into London. Now that half the babies born in London are born to mothers themselves born overseas. Mothers born in China, mothers born in India, mothers born in Pakistan, mothers born in Africa, mothers born in the West Indies, mothers born over the whole world. You can see the future of London in the maternity wards. It's going to be a coloured city. And in many parts of our capital, the British are a minority. And I will prove that to you. Because everything I say, I prove. Here is a photograph, an aerial photograph, which was published in the Daily Mail a couple of years back. Here's a photograph of a typical London street. All little terrace houses, neat little gardens. There's a lot of the sort of streets that many of us were born in, raised as children. Large parts of London have streets like this, large parts of Birmingham and Manchester. And the Daily Mail did an analysis. They looked into who lived in these houses in a typical London street. I think it's actually East Ham, actually. If you know, I think from the feel of it, it's East Ham, near West Ham football ground. There are families from India, Pakistan, Jamaica, Iraq, Iran, Kenya, Turkey, Bangladesh. Going down the list, because they've got the house numbers here. They don't tell you what road this is, but they tell you the house numbers, what family lives in what house. You've got to reach house number 40 to find an English family. And I should imagine, from my experience of these areas, that this English family, in fact, consists of, I would say, one elderly English woman. A woman who, as a little girl, probably lived in this or the neighbouring street, played with her little mates, when this country was still England, with her skipping ropes and her dolls, grew up to be a young woman, met a bloke, met her chap, got married, had children, and now, probably at the end of her life, her children have left home, her husband's probably, left this world, and she is living on her own in a neighbourhood that's utterly changed in her lifetime. And what's not clear from this photograph, which was printed in the accompanying article, was the crime. The crime dominates these areas. Everybody is afraid of crime in these areas. I have campaigned and canvassed in areas like this. Not as bad as this, there'd be no point. But I've campaigned in areas, knocked on doors, where maybe 1 house in 10 or 1 house in 5 are foreigners. And our technique then was just to plough on. I'm from the British National Party. We're against all this crime. And what you find is the coloureds, everybody is afraid of crime. Except the criminals, of course, because they dominate these areas and make life hell for everybody. In the accompanying article, they quote an Asian woman, a Hindu woman, as saying this area, wherever it is, I think it's East Ham, is dominated by Muslim youths who gather at either end of the street on warm evenings and insult and make vague threats to whoever passes. And the Hindu woman says, we're very concerned about all this. I feel very uneasy. So I will say here, I know I've made this speech to you before, and I've made this speech up and down this country. And I will say this, in a minute I'm going to refer to the speech that Peter Phillips made. I have no doubt that we British nationalists are the last chance for this country. I have no doubt. I'll come back to that in a minute, that we are the last chance, and it's very, very important that we continue, because we are the last chance. And I draw great feeling from the results that I've just spoken to you about, how we got 1 million votes at the Euros, we put up 1,000 candidates last year's elections. What I would like to come back to and reinforce is the points that Peter Phillips was making to you about this country and the dire state of our finances. I have been studying the economics of this country for years. It's not a subject most people think about, they take it all for granted. But I know that we are in a perilous state, and I'd like to pick up on the figures that Peter Phillips has brought to your attention. I'd like to point out that figure up the top, £170 billion a year. What that means is, that is the current deficit as Peter Phillips described. Now, the current deficit in 1 year means, as Peter said, the government gets so much money in taxes, which it does, that's the source of the government's income, by and large taxes, and then the government spends the money on, there's the list, pensions, benefit, health, education, defence, etc, etc, etc. The difference is that our government, in order to fund that, we are spending so much money more, the government is spending so much money on that list over there, spending so much money more than the government gets in taxes, that our government has to borrow, or borrowed last year, £170,000 million. What that means is, almost every day of the working week, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday and into Thursday, the British government borrows £1,000 million a day. The British government borrows £1,000 million a day to fund the deficit, in order to fund that. Now, I'd like to just say a little bit more than what Peter said. Peter introduced it, I'd like to bring in a bit more. I've said that in order to maintain our standard of living, in order to pay those benefits, pensions, health, education, defence and local government, our government borrows £1,000 million. Borrows it from other people. Who does it borrow it from? Where's this money coming from? Who is the British government borrowing the money from? I'll answer the question, simplifying it somewhat. The bulk of this money is being borrowed from foreigners, and the bulk of the money that the British government borrows every day comes from two sources: Saudi Arabia, Muslim Saudi Arabia, and the communist government of the People's Republic of China. Now, ladies and gentlemen, it's not a clever thing to get into hock to moneylenders, whoever the moneylenders be, whether they're the Muslim King Saud of Saudi Arabia or the communist government of the People's Republic of China. In order to maintain our standard of living, the British government, almost every day, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday and into Thursday, borrows £1,000 million every day. But the beginning of the week again, Monday, they're back in there borrowing that money. Oh, a question. Well, I'll answer the question. And, answer first, question second. I'm making it easy for you, right? Answer first, question second. I will tell you, the standard of living, if you work that sum out, 170, the British government borrows in a year £170,000 million, that is almost 1,000 million a day, to keep up our standard of living. Do the sums if you like, I've checked it umpteen times myself, it's staggering, it is staggering, ladies and gentlemen, but each one of your families, each one of you and your families' standard of living, the benefits you get over there, is subsidised by all this borrowing to the tune of £300 a week. £300 a week. And if King Saud of Saudi Arabia, and if the Communist government of the People's Republic of China was to say, no, 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 our standard of living would drop instantly by £300 a week. Ladies and gentlemen, I let you think, I've known this for a long time. I've thought about it and thought about it and thought about it. I gave this particular speech a year ago in Leicestershire, and there was a woman in the audience working all this out. Looks like probably a school teacher. And I said, "Madam, check it out, because it's astounding." She agreed with me. The standard of living of every family in this country is supported by all that borrowing going on that to the tune of £300 a week. If the Chinese, the communist government of mainland China and King Saud of Saudi Arabia, just en passant, as they say in French, en passant, I take it you know that most mosques built in Britain are paid for by the King Saud of Saudi Arabia. Just a little nuance. Just a little nuance. When you're in debt to people, you're in debt. And our standard of living of each one of our families is supported to the tune of £300 a week. That is staggering. This country is technically bankrupt. You can prove that a number of ways. You see how we're having to pay. When you borrow money, apart from getting into the grip of the moneylenders, you've got to pay interest on it. You've got to pay interest. You borrow somebody else's money, you've got to pay interest. There's also the minor problem of having to pay the money back. No one even thinks about paying the money back. You know, the Tories are trying to cut down this deficit. They're trying to cut £170 billion a year down to £164 billion a year. That's their ambition. Their ambition. Not to pay it back or to reduce 170 billion to zero, but to cut 170 next year down to 164 billion. Like a bloody drug addict, isn't it? That's the situation that we're in. Now, when you borrow money, one of the snags is you have to pay interest on it. We are now paying interest of £43 billion a year just to service the debt. Now, given that there's 52 weeks in the year, that means we're paying almost £1 billion a week to service the debt. Meanwhile, at the same time, we are borrowing something like £3.5 billion a week just to keep the thing afloat. The time will come when the people we owe the money to, well, let me put it this way. Supposing I keep tapping my friend Peter here and keep borrowing 100 quid off of him, and there's a certain amount of interest, and Peter says to me one day, "Richard, you promised to pay me 5% interest, you owe me 50 quid, Richard." Like that 43 billion, right? Not 43 billion, but 50 quid interest. And Peter was to say to me, "Richard, you owe me 50 quid, all the money you borrowed off of me." And I was to say, "Yeah, that's right, Pete, that's right. You can't lend us 50, can you?" Hey? When you say that, that's the end of it. It collapses. And that's what's happened to that's what happened to Greece now. It's about to happen to Portugal. Southern Ireland is on the balance. And I tell you, there's nothing, as Peter said, our finances are no healthier than the finances of Greece, Portugal or Southern Ireland. And I'll tell you one more thing, which you may or may not find believable. I'll leave it up to you, because we are British nationalists. I'll tell you an interesting fact. Peter brought it out here. The only way really to understand these huge figures, is to compare one huge figure with another huge figure. And Peter did it for you. The official government debt, the accumulated debt, that's the deficit, how much it piles up every year. It gets worse and worse. They're borrowing 170 billion every year. Last year, this year, next year. It has accumulated, the total debt has accumulated 190 billion, right? That's the total debt, what it's piled up to. Which, if you compare it to the gross national product, how much the total wealth that we produce in 1 year, we're a relatively wealthy country, the total value of all the services and cars and machines and design work that we produce in a year, then the British government's debt is 63%, this sum here is 63%, not quite 2/3 of the gross national product of Great Britain. According to the European Union, it should be a lot less. According to the European Union, the debt should never be more than 60% of the gross national product. We've now got up to 63% of the gross national product. In the United States of America, the United States of America is so indebted that the indebtedness of the United States government, we're not talking about US citizens here with mortgages or buying a car on the tick, the indebtedness of the United States government is 100% of the gross national product of the United States of America, which happens to be, if you're interested, $14 trillion. I'll just tell you that. $14 trillion. The United States is so indebted that they've got a rule in the United States of America that the debt of the United States government, is not to exceed 100% of the gross national product of the United States of America. I know I'm talking fast, but you got the point, right? There is a law. The debt of the US government is not by law to exceed 100% of the gross national product. Now, it's edging really up to it fast. The US borrows a great deal more every day than Britain does, being a much bigger country. And the US is racing towards that 100% line. Now, there's a huge political row going on in the United States between the Democrats, who, like the socialists, love to spend them dollars, and the Republicans, who tend to represent the taxpayers, who the Republicans want to lift the 10%, the 100% barrier to 110, so that the US government can carry on borrowing money. And the Republicans say, no deal, because they're no friend of Obama. The Republicans control the Senate, and they are stopping Obama's Democratic government from extending the 100% barrier up to 105 or 110%, because the Democrats want to carry on borrowing money. And it's not impossible, the date is sometime in August, that the United States government will go bankrupt, and United States employees, including American soldiers in Afghanistan, won't get their wages paid. I tell you that as a little something. We're not particularly concerned with the problems of the USA, but the whole Western world is living way above its means. Now, somebody said to me at one of my meetings, I made this point, he said, well, there's nothing wrong with us, nothing wrong with us, and I would agree. I would say to you, one way of looking at this, huge debts, benefits, pensions, health, education, is because we have allowed into our country millions of foreigners. Half the babies born in London are born to foreigners. We have allowed millions of foreigners into our country who we are giving first-class standard of living to. Let me just tell you something whilst we're talking economics. Economics is very important, of course, because economics pays for the food in our stomachs, economics pays for the clothes we wear, economics pays for a roof over our head. So economics is important. Let me tell you the dangers, the absolute dangers of the world that we live in, the absolute dangers. How does it come about that the communist government of the People's Republic of China has got so much money? How much? I don't know if you saw the news today, but Northumberland Water Company is going to be bought up by the Chinese. Is that not humiliating and shameful? So how does it come that the Chinese have got so much money they can buy up a water company? So we've got to drink their water, they control it. How does it come about? It comes about because of a decision made in the United States of America under President Ronald Reagan in the early 90s, and a parallel decision made by Margaret Thatcher in the 1980s. I hope I've not offended anybody here. In the 1980s, it was called the liberalisation of the City of London, or the liberalisation of Wall Street over there. Up until the early 80s, in the Britain, as in the US, capital, money made in Britain, had to stay in Britain. You know, it's our money. Maggie Thatcher, liberalised the City of London. It was called the Big Bang, if you remember all that. She liberalised the City of London, which meant the City of London, for the first time, could invest our money in the cheap labour countries of the Far East. The result is that the car factories in Britain were deliberately run down, Rover and all that were deliberately run down, and they set up brand new factories, first of all in South Korea, where Hyundai cars come from. Within 10 years, the Koreans were making more cars than Britain. Those Hyundai cars are all designed in Britain. That's British money over there, British capital, British technology, British capital. And now they've switched from South Korea to China. Britain, the City of London, and Wall Street has invested vast sums in China. Well, what's the attraction of China? The attraction is coolie labour, very, very disciplined. They work for peanuts, work for pennies, work for pennies. They work for pennies. They're disciplined, they're industrious, they're intelligent of a style. They can make cars, they can make practically everything. Practically everything. Go into the supermarket, because I have an engineering background. I go into the supermarket and I look at things, but it's a pair of cheap scissors, knitting needles, television flat screens, computer parts, practically all made in China. It's actually all designed in the West. The whole caboodle is designed in the West by white technicians, but all made in China because they work for peanuts over there, pennies. The result is, then having been assembled for workers, highly disciplined, highly trained workers working for pennies, it's then sold in the West at Western prices. So there's tremendous differential between the labour costs down here and the price they get over here when they sell the goods over here. They sell it deliberately just cheap enough to knock our factories out, which is why everything is now, made overseas. That means that China has accumulated vast sums of capital, vast sums of money, which they just use to lend to the British and even more profitably to the Americans. Now, I'll just go off a bit of a tangent here again. At this meeting that I spoke at in Leicester a year ago, when the first time I really I've got a friend in Leicester who is, he understands as well as I do how dangerous this economics is, how dangerous. He said, Richard, we've got a bit of a lull, the general election's come and gone, because the general election was in May, so about June or July. We want to keep the people together, give a speech about economics. So I've had all this in my mind, so I wrote it all down and got the facts at my fingertips. And that was the theme, the absolute danger. You can see the danger. No one is going to invest in Britain if you can invest in China. No one's going to do it. Yes, when I was in Leicester, I illustrated these points. Someone had shown me a photograph. This was the meeting in Leicester was in about June or July 2010, and the photograph went back to January 2010, and it showed President Obama, the United States President, who's about as tall and about as thin as I am, and it showed Obama going to Japan to borrow even more money off the Japanese. And you saw President Obama bowing to the president, to the emperor of Japan. Now the Japanese are a small race, and the emperor of Japan's a little old man down here somewhere. And Obama, he must have practiced it for bloody hours, because I can't even do it. But because I'm getting old and stiff. Anyway, he bowed like this, so low down. It's called kowtowing in these Asians. And he was grovelling. He was grovelling for bloody money. He's the president of the United States of America. Really went, I can't do it. I can't go any further than that. But he went really L-shaped in front of the president, or not the president, in front of the Emperor of Japan, because the Yanks need the money. If you need money, you've got to grovel. And the next day, he flew from Tokyo to Peking and repeated the trick in front of the president, the communist president. They must have enjoyed that, eh? The communist president of the People's Republic of China. Once again, Obama did. They call it kowtowing in China. Kowtowing. I tell you, for those of you, did a bit of English literature in your schools and still remember it, there's a famous poet about 100 years ago called Rudyard Kipling. A famous poet called Rudyard Kipling, about 1900. Rudyard Kipling was a British bloke, but he spent many years with the British Army in India. And he used to write these stories about British soldiers. Some of them are very, very moving stories about British soldiers serving in India, a long, long way from home, in 1900s. And he's told a story about two sergeants. I think they was the sergeants of the regiment called the Bucks, an East Anglian regiment, who for some reason or other ended up in China about 1890. And this is Rudyard Kipling told this story about these two British sergeants who somehow or other, some ghastly misfortune, were captured by Chinese warlords or whatever. And the story as told by Rudyard Kipling, that these two British soldiers were told to kowtow to their Chinese captors. And they refused. They said, we're British, we won't kowtow, won't grovel on all this business, won't do it. They said, if you don't do it, we'll chuck you in a snake pit. Chuck you in a hole in the ground with bloody serpents hissing around. And the story, according to Rudyard Kipling, is those sergeants said, chuck us in a snake pit, we're not going to kowtow to you. I don't know the full strength of that story, but that was told by Rudyard Kipling, and he told many moving stories about British soldiers in India. One's called the hanging of Danny Deeva, if you want to get a moving story about the execution of a British soldier. The hanging of Danny Deeva, very moving. My father served in India many years as a British soldier. That's another story. Anyway, nowadays the President of the United States of America kowtows, and today's news: the Chinese are buying up the water up in Northumbria. Do you know who owns the big British Leyland rover plant in Longbridge, Birmingham? It's owned by the Chinese. The whole thing is absolutely shameful and dangerous. I tell you, the way this world works, the white man is redundant because they'll move all the work to the Far East where they work for pennies. That is why we British nationalists are absolutely needed. Look, I'll give you 5 more minutes, then we'll pack up. I have no doubt that we have a great future in front of us. I would just like to say one final thing about leaders and leadership. I'd like to give you my ideas of the future of our movement. I tell you how I see the future of our movement. I see our movement as leaders and leadership. I see the leaders are absolutely needed, and the leaders are people like yourselves up and down this country, including these wonderful women here, including Sharon Wilkinson, who I know very, very well, Marlene Guest, and all these other women, and their husbands and their menfolk, and this souvenir, which I've kept, a wonderful souvenir edition, to go into their communities and campaign in their communities. Brave men and women campaigning in their communities. Lib, Lab and Con have utterly failed. Labour has destroyed these inner cities. The Tories are destroying our economy. And listen, and I, like you, I sometimes think to myself, have I got this out of proportion? And I know these figures, and you can be bedazzled by them, actually. And I say to myself, because I live in London, and I know the crime, the murders and the rapes every day in London, the stabbings every day. No one could bring up a family in these areas. You can't have your children going to a school where every day 5 get stabbed. In the school sometimes. Civilization is collapsing in the inner areas. And I say to myself, if the finance ministers, if the chancellors of the Exchequer, if the bankers, if the big boys in the City of London, if they've done as much damage to our economy and our economic prospects in the future, if they've done as much damage as politicians and Home Secretaries have done to inner London, which is destroyed, then one can only say, God help us. And I'll repeat my faith that only the British nationalism can save this situation. And I have no doubt that leaders are arising, that leaders who will campaign and save their nation, their neighbourhoods. That's the only way to do it, save their towns and neighbourhoods. And I'll say that's leaders. And I'll say one final word about leadership. There happens to be a leadership challenge taking place in this party now. We're not allowed to promote one candidate or another, and I've no intention of doing so. I'll just say a few words about leadership. For many years I was at the top of this party, and I will say the role, I've thought about this a great deal, and I speak from experience, that in principle the leadership has got 3 functions. One is to keep the party solvent, whereby the expenditure is always within the income, so we never get into debt, we can pay all our bills, keep the party solvent. The other is to keep the party legal, so that we do our best not to break the law. We don't want to be in and out the law courts all the time. And the third role of the leadership is to keep the party together. Remembering we're all men and women with all sorts of ideas in our heads. We're always going to be a broad church. Always going to be a broad church. We want to be a broad church that represents the British people, so that everybody feels at home with us and we represent the British people. So that's the three functions of the leadership. In theory, it's quite simple. Keep the party solvent, keep it legal and keep it together. And that's the leadership. But the leaders, they're these brave men and women out there in their communities. Well, thanks for listening to me. Thank you very much.